Well, hello, Bible love. Great to be with y'all. Today or tomorrow or someday this week is St. Francis Day. Who knows when this is even coming out? Is it Monday, Alan? Is today Monday?
Today's Monday.
So this is going to come out on Thursday. So that means this week is St. Francis Day that we celebrate, and you'll see lots of blessing of the animals if you're on Facebook, and lots of cats and dogs and stuffed animals and all that good stuff. And if you remember this summer, listeners, I prayed this every time we did a new Women in Ministry podcast. So we're bringing it back. Okay, so the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Lord, make us instruments of your peace. When there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
Amen. So we are diving into Ezra. We'll be looking at 1 through 6 today. And we're bringing in someone, this is the first time we're doing this, right? The Episcopal world is small, but it's not quite small enough because there are folks out there we don't know. And so I threw it out on the Forma Facebook group, which is a Facebook group with a lot of people that have a lot of ideas and a lot of opinions. And I said, hey, does anyone want to talk about scripture? A couple of people reached out, the first of whom is the Reverend Claire Brown. She's the rector of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Athens, Tennessee. I said the Episcopal Church is small. Mary Balfour and Claire just spent like 10 minutes talking about all the people in the South that they know and have in common. And I'm just over here in Texas, like, you do your thing.
Yeah.
So Claire, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, it was fun. Like Claire and I are both younger women rectors of churches. And so we had a lot of fun talking about that. Proud of you, Claire, and your ministry, and so glad to have you in the fold. And as Alan and I say, if you come on the Bible Love podcast, you instantly become our friend. So we are so grateful that you're here. And we're talking about Ezra, right?
Ezra, not in my top 10 picks for sermon prep, I gotta say.
Right.
And does it even come for the lectionary for us?
I look this up all the time. I didn't this time. Let me look real quick. Y'all talk amongst yourselves.
I think it's, I'm guessing it is not in there because I'm not sure I have ever preached on this. Although I tend to not be an Old Testament preacher. I need to be better about that. But it is these are two little interesting books that we're talking about right now, Ezra and Nehemiah. In fact, Ezra today, we're just doing Ezra 1 through 6, but there are only, let's see, how many book or chapters in the whole book? There's not many.
It's like 10. Yeah.
Right. So Claire, tell us some of the things that really stuck out for you when you were reading Ezra 1 through 6. What are some things that you were like, that's interesting?
Yeah. So this is a fascinating book in some ways, but not very preachable. I think it would be probably a really solid formation study, but because it's all the details and working out the logistics of how are God's people returning home? How are they walking out of the Babylonian captivity and into God's promises? And it turns out that just like most of the big transitions and big hopes and moves of our lives today, there's a lot of really boring details and stress and conflict that is happening behind the scenes. And so this is the outworking of that, which is probably why we're not getting Ezra chapter 2 with its bizarrely detailed census of everyone's descendants and how many animals of every kind in our Sunday lection. We don't want that. We don't want to preach about that. But there is a beautiful humanity, I think, to seeing behind the scenes of how these people are actually working out the beautiful poetic promises like we read in the book of Jeremiah and these words of the prophets. Here's actually the history of what it meant to walk back home, what it meant to go return to your grandparents' homeland that you have no memory of, having really high expectations and it not going the way you thought it would, running into people that you thought you would be kin to or find congruence with and finding conflict instead. It's just very relatable stuff tucked in here in this little book.
Yeah, Claire, I'm really glad you said that, because I do think sometimes we're like, why is all this here? Like, why do we need to know like all this history and all that? Like literally there's like pages and pages and pages of the Israelite clans and the list, why do we need to know all that? And sometimes we do like get caught up in the weeds of it all. But I appreciated your take on that it's like actually a relatable thing for us, not just a history lesson, because this is just like our life is too. Like when you tell a story, you got to kind of tell some of the background of the story, right? Like I preached about my dogs yesterday, y'all, Hazel and Sugar. I know Alan's rolling his eyes, but I couldn't just be like Hazel and Sugar. I had to say like when we got Hazel, when we got Sugar, I know I'm comparing my dogs to the Bible, but you know what I mean? Like you need the background, you need it all. So I appreciate your take on that, Claire. I think that's really good. Now that Alan's done laughing at me, I'm sure he has something to say.
No, it makes, you'll probably hear a lot about this over the next year of the podcast, but I started docent training at the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth. So I'm going to be a tour guide in an art museum. It's basically like a college art class.
I love it.
Yeah, the first session, the Modern Art Museum, it's a beautiful building itself is art. And so the first thing was a tour of the building, and we watched this documentary about the making of it. And there's this quote, I think the quote's by Frank Gehry, the architect. He says that a building starts as an idea that's immeasurable, and then it becomes plans and things that are infinitely measurable, and then it becomes something, again, immeasurable. And I think about this, like the idea of the people of God, right? Like it's a big idea. And then you've got to have all this stuff. You've got to have Ezra, where it says these people and this distance and all of that, so that you can then get to the other side, where hopefully someday it'll become a reality, that it becomes immeasurable again. But it's important for us, I think, to look at the junk that's in the middle of this, and the list of names that no one can pronounce, and all of these things.
Yeah. Well, and even in chapter 1, just, getting into the text, starting at verse 6, we see this, just basically the inventory of loot that they get sent home with, which has some nice parallels that I think we can assume are intentional with the liberation from Egypt. When it was time to go find your promised land, your neighbors voluntarily gave you everything you would need and said, please get out of here. So we're seeing that kind of repeated. But in this case, it's also, it's not new loot, right? It's what was taken before, and going back and recovering that and saying, we're going to return this home with you. But even the details there, right? Gold basins and silver and bowls and other bowls and knives and all of these things.
Say how many? Excuse me for interrupting. Does your Bible say how many of each?
Oh, yes.
I mean, like that's so detailed.
It's a lot of stuff, and it can feel a little fluffy. But what's funny is actually, I on my to-do list this week is to touch base with my altar guild chair, because the altar guild wanted to go in together and purchase something for worship in our parish in honor of a member of the altar guild who died recently. And so I was thinking about how even in our Episcopal tradition, the idea of giving specific vessels for worship that have a practical use, but are also very beautiful with someone's name and legacy involved, can sometimes be cumbersome, but often also comes from this place of love and connection to the service and work that person had. And so I was even thinking, like, I wonder if this is also, does somebody have in the back of their mind, oh, I know those 30 gold bowls. And I remember this moment in worship when I was a little girl before the captivity. And, is there community memory that goes along with these belongings and has kept them holy in the minds and hearts of the people?
Yeah, I think about when I served in Upper South Carolina. Everything in Texas is like brand new. 10 years is old around here. But when I was in Upper South Carolina, like I would celebrate with a chalice or a paten that's like 150 years old. I'm thinking about like all the people before me that have elevated this, all the people that it sit from. Like there's something to that. Some kid is going to hold one of these gold bowls and be like, my great grandfather was the first one that brought this in. Or, there is that community legacy of it that this has been used for worship for long before we got here, God willing, long after we're gone. And it holds that community memory. That's a beautiful idea.
Yeah. And I hope I'm not getting into anything too tricky, but I thought this was very interesting. I don't know if y'all have read at all, but the Episcopal Church and the Athens Church are trying in South Carolina are trying to like come together and take the lawsuits off the table, which is all beautiful and wonderful. And there's like this real detailed list of like who was getting what and who had to give up what. And one of the things I saw was some of the chalice and patens, neither one were getting, and they were going to a museum in Charleston. And I thought how beautiful that was and how important they were. That not one wanted it over the other, that it actually needed to go to this place where everybody could visit them and put their eyes on them and see it and not have a home in one place or the other. I thought that was really beautiful reconciliation, to figure that out. Because even these things that we're talking about, these physical things that we're talking about are really important to people. They really, really are. So sorry if I got into something too political, but I just thought that was really sort of interesting that they chose to do that. So anyway, back to Ezra. Claire,
yeah, but I think that's a way of connecting, right, between our tradition and what we're reading here, is that the stuff can get in the way, but when we don't put it in the way, it can be this lens into the holy, and it becomes holy because we use it for holy things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Something, Claire, you said when we're talking before we hit record was this is all preparation for re-entering after the exile, right? And we just hit like 2 years on this podcast, which means we're a little over 2 years, whatever, from the pandemic. And some places are just figuring out we're all just figuring out how are we the church today. Not that we're not going to compare this to the exile, but we were out of our buildings for a time, right? When we come back, we have very detailed lists. Instead of like 30 gold bowls, we have like 6 feet separation. And we have these very detailed things of how are we going to be a community when we get back from this. So I was just interested in your thoughts on that. I mean, how in what we're reading here, do you reflect on anything you're experiencing at St. Paul's?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Can we have permission to kind of skip chapter 2, which was just a list of
it was
Sure.
totally
Okay.
to the worst.
Great. Well, let's skip chapter 2, because I think chapter 3 is actually where we see that being spoken to. There's this really, we still see this setup there. They've gone, like they've returned to the homeland. They've started to settle in towns, which is also like, that's an immigrant and refugee imagery, right? That you're showing up and the house your grandparents lived in might not be there.
Right.
And so there's a lot, even as detailed and cumbersome and bureaucratic as this text is, think about all the families, right? What was the final number? Over 42,000 people. Yes. So that's the size of my entire rural county in Tennessee. If we all had to like pack up McMinn County, Tennessee, and move thousands of miles, this is just the tip of the iceberg of detailed lists of things that people were figuring out. But they've
taken a heck of a lot of people to wrangle too, and like put back and to put back into a system of worshiping and rebuilding, and that's a lot of taking care of.
Yes, that's a lot of details of common life.
Yeah.
But in that, they're also setting up to build the altar. And that's kind of first things first. We have to have an altar so that we can start having some form of worship, which almost, again, not to be trite in our comparison, but thinking about, okay, well, we can't gather together it's March 2020 and we don't know what to do. What can we do? Well, I guess we can do Zoom morning prayer, which feels like not the same at all, but we've got to start somewhere, right? But then as it goes on toward the end of this chapter, they've finally getting to a place where they've, I imagine clearing away rubble and amassing resources and just getting people organized. And we see that, they had to start paying the workers kind of ahead so that they could plan and get to it. And it's 2 years after they've arrived at the house of God in Jerusalem. They're in verse 8. So 2 years after Cyrus says you can go, and then they arrive. So there's travel time. Then they've just gotten themselves ready for 2 whole years, and they finally lay the foundations, and the priests in their vestments are stationed to praise the Lord with trumpets. And they sing responsively, and all the people responded with a great shout when they praised the Lord because the foundation had been laid. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of families, old people who had seen the first house on its foundations, wept with a loud voice when they saw this house, though many shouted aloud for joy. And I just think about all the times in the last year, because it's been about a year since my folks went back in our building. We worshiped outdoors for a long time. And there was such a mix of joy and sorrow all together. Just this fall, like it took us almost a whole year just to get acolyte training back. Because kids forgot or graduated or decided they'd rather work on the weekends, or,
Yep.
And so getting acolytes back last month, people were crying about these like wrinkled, scraggly teenagers tracking grass up the aisle, right?
Love it.
Because it's a symbol of what was before. The first Holy Week since 2019 in our space together, the first Christmas in our space together, all of those milestones that are a recollection of what was before. And then, of course, our community, like others, we see the ebb and flow of growth and loss in the last few years. And so the first Holy Week in our space was also the first Holy Week without longstanding members of our community who had died since the last time that happened. I don't know. What do y'all hear here in this section?
Yeah, I mean, when I was reading this, I could not help but think about the pandemic. I don't know when you started at St. Paul's, Claire, but I started at Resurrection in October of 2019. So I'm just at my 3rd year. So I literally like 4 months and then this pandemic. So I don't really know what it was like before the pandemic. I mean, I had one Christmas, and so what's been interesting to me is when I read this and comparing it, I mean, I went right to the pandemic, is watching the church open up again and going back to the way we did things before, but also not going back to the way there are some things that are very different. So this wording of the rebuilding of the temple, to me, it feels like it really is rebuilding in a lot of ways. Some things that we had before and some things that we didn't. For example, during the pandemic, when we finally got back in the church, I had everybody, when you go up for communion, to go from the back to the front so that you would go out the side doors and come back in so that nobody was around each other, right? Trying to keep everybody safe. They love that. And we have not switched it back. You start at the back of the church at Church of the Resurrection. And I hope 80 years from now, they're still still at the back of the church. And we can be like, hey, that changed at pandemic. And you get a little breath of fresh air during the middle of the church, service, and you get to go outside and hear the birds chirp. They love that. So that to me is sort of what might be happening here in Ezra as well. Like, what new things are going to come about in this. Now, I know there's some turmoil in that, but, Alan, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, these folks are no doubt shaped and formed by the exile. And so they come back and it's not the way it's always been. And that's the battle. Is we're all rectors. I'm sure we've all been asked, when can we go back to the way it was?
Right.
We literally can't. We can start to do things like we were accustomed to, but it's still going to be different. And so how can we come back to those things that we cherish? How can we let go of those things that maybe should have let go of? And how can we incorporate the new things we knew, right? Like, you mentioned Zoom morning prayer. I did my first Eucharist on Zoom from a home office with some bread and a cup of wine in September of 2017. So I was in the midst of Hurricane Harvey, right? And so the neighborhood around the church, I was flooded out of my house, all this stuff. And I remember talking to Jim Powell, my liturgy professor, and was like, I feel really uncomfortable about this. He's like, we can debate whether or not it's Eucharist, but it's what your people need, right? And then you fast forward 3 years later, I'm helping, I'm on diocesan staff at this point. I'm helping everybody all over Upper South Carolina figure out questions about liturgical theology and whatever. Like, this is a pastoral response. But like, you think about these Zoom morning prayers. My congregation in Houston, 5 years later, every morning and every evening, they do Facebook Live morning devotions in Compline. And they've been going for 5 years. And so that's become a part of that community's life, right? And so how can we take these things we learned in exile? How can we take these and incorporate it into the new people of God that we've become?
Yeah. That's awesome. All right, y'all, in the interest of time, I want to make sure we get through. Okay, so Claire, help us here. But I mean, something happens. We get excited about building this temple, and then it's like, whoop, brakes are really put on hold, right? Because some opposition happens. So will you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, let's talk about it. But here's my question that I did not get clear and do enough homework on. I'll own that.
Okay.
When we jump into chapter 4, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple, on and on. Who were the adversaries?
Oh, yeah. I don't know.
Or is that a straw man situation?
Yeah, I think it's
some people say. Yeah. I've heard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
okay. That was your vibe too.
Don't own that, Claire, because we're all coming at you with the same thing. Like, we don't know. But something happened, right? Somebody was opposing something.
Yeah. And then we see, there in verse 3, here's, to me, who's the adversaries is an interesting question, but it's maybe not the most helpful, because we can't always control who the adversaries are, but we can control our response.
Right.
But Zerubbabel, who is this leader of God's people, says, you shall have no part with us in building a house for our God, but we alone will build for the Lord, the God of Israel. Mm. And that is just spiteful. Yep.
Down.
Hard line. You're not here with us. You're not invited.
That's a hard no, as my brother would say. Sometimes I'll ask him a question and I assume the answer is going to be no. He's like, it's not a no, it's a hard no. And that's what this is. Like, that's a hard no. And so then what do they have to do? They have to work through it to figure out, because they've been in exile all this time and they want to build this temple.
Yeah. And we know, from other resources in the history of this region, that there was some significant tension between those who were returning from exile and those who had been left behind in the first place. Of those who had gone to Babylon feeling as if they were the true remnant. And so it's a creation of another ethnic group from within the people of God. And this, I think, we could argue, like, did that happen? Did that distinction happen at the exile? Or is really this the moment where that's cemented? When there's an opportunity to not see someone as an adversary, but as a partner, and instead choose to draw the line.
Yeah. I mean,
big question.
Because you think about, Dr. Tony hinted at this, it's like people are often exiled. They're figuring out how to make community. The people around them are other people. And so they partner up and they intermarry and all of this. And then they come back and they're like, you go here, but your wife or your husband or your kids, they got to go there. like that's no longer an intellectual exercise. During the exile and all that, I think maybe you're right. Like there's something interesting to think about, but it really becomes a distinction when you try to walk in the temple and you've got someone who doesn't belong. What do you do in those moments?
Yeah.
You know, I think, you know, Mary Balfour, you brought up the Episcopal Anglican split, and that's a whole nother deal. We're not going to talk about that. But in the Diocese of Virginia, right? No, because I think in the Diocese of Virginia, the rector of Truro Parish, which is an Anglican congregation, and the former bishop of Virginia, they're like, there's things we disagree about, but like, what can we do together? Right. And that's what I hear in South Carolina. You know, they're trying to figure out, we're going to disagree, but like, we got to move past this, right? Like we Protestants are no longer killing Catholics. Catholics are no longer killing Protestants, right? That happened for a while.
Right.
Because like we were trying to set that hard no. 500 years later, we can say, oh yeah, we're siblings. Yeah. But how do you do that in the moment? Yeah. Right? How do we do that with Anglicans? Right? How do we do that with people who don't fit our description? I wrote it down, but could you say the way you phrased it? Like, what's the risk of us making our vision too small?
Mm-hmm. I think
when it comes to who our neighbor is.
I don't remember what I said, but that sounds good.
Yeah. No, I'm giving you credit for that. I mean, there's a risk there. Like we think we're protecting something, but what is it actually costing us to have too small of a vision?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I also, you know, we've just met, we're just becoming friends. So I'm married to a community organizer who directs a nonprofit that's grassroots organizing across the state of Tennessee. And so I am influenced by his work. And I also see through all these 6 chapters, especially chapter 1 and chapter 4, part of me is, you know, I hear his voice in the back of my head saying, kings don't just decide to do things. There were people on the ground working to make this happen. Mm-hmm. Who was it, right? And I think we don't see that with chapter 1. Mm-hmm. Chapter 1 is kind of getting the motivator behind the power is the Spirit of God. Here, though, where we see there's opposition, it is it's attributed to these different contributing agents who, you know, wrote the letters and did the antagonistic campaign to stop the building after they were excluded. And so there's also this interesting political element that's happening. And I mean political in the sense of how are people organizing themselves and either resisting or aligning with power to achieve their goals, and how the smallest political unit is actually a conversation, right? The conversation you could have said, let's work together, or no, you have no part in this. And then it escalates and builds from there.
Your husband, does he work, is his grassroots group, is it part of the DART network?
No, it's
okay. So there's a group in the Midlands of South Carolina where I live, Columbia area, that was, and they're big. I mean, everything builds to this confrontation where elected leaders stand there and the people, they call that, maybe we can talk about it in a couple of weeks, the Nehemiah action. Because right, it comes from this section where like the king's doing this and the people organize and say, king, you probably shouldn't do that. And this is right out of that playbook, is the people rising up and saying, we have a voice, you're going to hear it. And how do we find our voice? And that's part of what I hear in this.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they do find their voice, right? Because they start working on this temple again, right? So that's chapter 5. I'm gonna keep moving us, y'all, because my time is off. Okay?
No, well, and the transition at the end of chapter 4, I think, catapults us there, is that they get the letter, they stop working, and then they wait until the 2nd year of the reign of the next king, which is also savvy organizing to say, I'm going to let you get a year under your feet before I ask you for this big thing.
Very smart. I thought about that too. I was like, this is a good organizer. They understand. Let's not just move right into the next thing. Much like, we finished our capital campaign. Let's start another one. You know, give them a year. Give them a year. Let them think about it a little bit, right? So they give them a year, and then they begin working on this temple again, which is chapter 5. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's some beautiful things that happen in that. And I want us to talk about it if we have time. And then chapter 6 is all about sort of these emperors coming back, and also this temple being dedicated and the Passover beginning. And I can just envision this like beautiful celebration of ministry moment with this temple being dedicated. You know what I mean? Like those just really holy, or an ordination, or just when you feel the Spirit. You know, I just went to a Curcio closing yesterday. It was just what I envision heaven may be like, you know. That's what I'm thinking this is about in chapter 6. So what do y'all think? What were your thoughts? Nobody had thoughts on chapter 6?
No, I mean, I think it's the culmination of this effort. And you see, like in chapter 6, verse 16, it starts to talk about they offered the dedication. They had 100 bulls, 200 ram. Like they're going all out. I mean, they're celebrating the fruits of their labor. And I mean, it sets up and saying, we did this. And part of that is not just the building, I don't think, is in the midst of all of that work is they've figured out, or they're figuring out, how are we the people of God again? And so kind of it's the rebuilding of the temple, right? But it's also the rebuilding of the people. And let's celebrate it all. Kind of like the celebration of new ministry. I had mine a couple of months ago. It has very little to do with me. It has everything to do with us in my congregation.
Yeah.
And I see that here. It's not the building, it's the community.
Mm-hmm. And I think we see that too, that this section ends with the Passover.
Right.
We began with this return from exile, return from slavery connection. And here, this is, remember the feast that makes us who we are.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad you said it. And I don't know what version y'all are using. I'm in the Good News Bible, but one thing that just, when talking about rebuilding and the temple dedicated and the Passover, the word joy is over and over and over in this version, and I hope it is in yours too. And that those kind of words get me excited, make me feel excited, because yes, God's work is really tough, which is in these 6 chapters. I feel like we've seen that, like some really tough work, but like a lot of joy too. And how do we get more focused on the joy than just all the tough work?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Claire, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any parting words that we must know about anything?
I don't think so, but this was a delight.
Okay, well, here's what my parting words are to you, Claire. I loved getting to know you. What a joy to have you on today. And I want to know what your favorite psalm is so that you can come back next semester. And like, we're still in school, I talk in semesters, but church talks in semesters, right? So you can come back and talk about your favorite psalm with us, because we're going to be spending a lot of time in the Psalms. So thank you for being here with us, Claire. Listeners, as always, remember that we love you, but most importantly, God does.